All right, everybody ready? We're in the home stretch. Now, one of the interesting things about Moses is when he puts his prophet hat on, Moses is going to have his prophet hat on and also be given kind of the foundational understanding of this fork in the road idea, going left or going right with regards to Israel's future. And let's look at a little bit of this in Deuteronomy chapter 28. So Moses is going to lay out the fork in the road with regards to Israel's, there's the fork in the road, Israel's obedience or disobedience and the consequences thereof. So woven in into the very fabric of covenant relationship, you see in 28 verse 15, consequences for disobedience. And it shall come about, if you will not obey the Lord your God, to observe, to do all of his commands, his statutes, with which I charge you today, that all these curses shall come upon you and overtake you. So the consequences for disobedience will be the Lord removing the blessings of life and vitality that he's been providing all along. And there's specific experiences of futility that are going to be interject into Israel's experience as a result of disobedience. Move over to verse 47 in chapter 28. Verse 47 and 49. Because you did not serve the Lord your God with joy and a glad heart for the abundance of all things, therefore you shall serve your enemies, whom the Lord shall send against you, in hunger, thirst, and nakedness, and in the lack of all things. He shall put an iron yoke on your neck until he has destroyed you. Now, the idea of destroying there, you see it tying into the next verse. The Lord will bring a nation against you from afar, from the end of the earth, as an eagle swoops down, a nation whose language you shall not understand, a nation of fierce countenance, who shall have no respect for the old, nor shall show no favor to the young. What are we describing here? This is the exilic experience, right? When a nation comes in and the Lord allows that nation to exile God's people. That's what we're seeing here. So the idea of ceasing to exist, verse 48, the idea of the destruction of a nation is really what we have to have in mind here. What happens when Israel loses her king, loses her land, loses her temple? She ceases to exist. She's destroyed. And that's what happens to Israel that goes into exile. And it's interesting when we get into the prophet Ezekiel, you know the passage, the famous dim bones, dim dry bones passage, right? You're looking at a skeleton until the Lord puts flesh on and brings back to life. So that picture of literally ceasing to exist shows up in some pretty in-your-face kind of images that we see later on. But the Lord will restore in response to the repentance of his people. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Chapter 30. Now what we have in chapter 30, beginning in verse 1. Now here's the balance of the God of the Old Testament. If we've seen him now as kind of mean and vindictive, now we're going to see him as the side of him that responds to his people and repentance with the idea of grace. Chapter 30, verse 1. So it shall be when all of these things have come upon you, the blessing and the curse which I've set before you, you call them to mind in all the nations where the Lord your God has banished you, and you return. Verse 2, that's the word for repent. You return, you shuv. Do 180 degrees and start walking in the opposite direction. And you return to the Lord your God and obey him with all your heart and soul according to all that I command you today, you and your sons. What will happen if then? Then the Lord your God will restore you from your captivity, have compassion on you, and will gather you again from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. What else will he do? The Lord your God, in verse 6, will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, in order that you may live. Some interesting language there starting to show up. You'll see it showing up again and again in prophets like Jeremiah, who will also have the concern for the new heart, the restored heart. Ezekiel will also have his concern for the interestingly, everybody look up here, this heart. That's what he's about doing, is giving life and vitality and restoring and renewing this heart in his people. As a result of, or in response, out of the exile, judgment comes before salvation. That's kind of we'll see when we get to the prophets. And then what I like, one of my high point passages of all time, you see kind of, if you read this, you want to read it out loud, maybe with not your wife and kids around, but in your quiet time, read this out loud, and you'll start to hear some pretty amazing preaching coming out. Let's look at verse 15 in chapter 30. When you read this, it's like you picture Moses standing on a rock, and he's got in front of him the entire group of Israelites on the plains of Moab. He's preaching to them, and he says, "See, I've set," and he points. What is he pointing to? He's pointing to the direction that they're going, right? "See, I've set before you today life and good, death and bad or adversity, in order that I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his commandments and his statutes and his judgments, so that you may live and multiply, and that the Lord your God may bless you in the land which you are entering to possess it. But," one of the big buts of the Bible, "if your heart turns away, and you will not obey, and are drawn away and worship other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall surely cease to exist as a nation. You shall not prolong your days in the land we are crossing over the Jordan, over there, to enter and possess it. I call heaven and earth today to witness against you that I've set before you today life and death, blessing and curse." So what I want you to do is choose life. Make the obvious choice, so that you and your descendants may live, by loving the Lord your God, by obeying his voice, by holding fast to him. For this is your life and the length of your days, that you may live in the land which the Lord your God swore to your fathers. It all goes back to the promise, the unconditional promises that the Lord made to the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So there you go. That's preaching, and that's instruction. That's what Moses is doing here. And interestingly, the prophets, when we get to our prophets class, you'll see that the prophets will build their message on many of the same passages that come right out of this section of Deuteronomy. In other words, when Amos, the covenant lawyer, builds his case against the northern nation Israel, he'll build his case on the teaching of Moses out of the book of Deuteronomy. When Jeremiah and Ezekiel start to wrestle with the audience that's asking the question, well, has God given up on us yet? Has he given up on us? We're in exile. Is this thing going to end? The answer is yes. He's going to point them ahead to the Lord's obligated to respond, and he'll restore. And the restoration passages that anticipate the day of the Lord, they all come back to many of the same passages that come out of Deuteronomy. Moses anticipates this restoration, this day of restoration. What will the Lord, when he comes? He'll do this, he'll do this, he'll do this, he'll do this. All of these things come out of the book of Deuteronomy. All right, got to get out of Deuteronomy and move ahead. Here's this picture. It's one of the greatest movies of all time. The original, not the new, not the Johnny Depp version, the original Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. This is this picture of obedience that I love to show.
Mr. Wonka, what's going to happen to the other cakes? Augustus, broken.
My dear boy, I promise you they'll be quite all right. When they leave here, they'll be completely restored to their normal, terrible selves. But maybe they'll be a little bit wiser for the wear. Anyway, don't worry about them. What do we do now, Mr. Wonka? Oh, yes, well, I hope you enjoyed yourselves. Excuse me for not showing you out. Straight up the stairs, you'll find the way. I'm terribly busy. Whole day wasted. Goodbye to you both. Goodbye.
What happened? Did we do something wrong?
I don't know, John. I'm going to find out. Walker, I am extraordinarily busy, sir. I just wanted to ask about the chocolate. The lifetime supply of chocolate for Charlie. Well, when does he get it? He doesn't. Why not? Because he broke the rules. What rules? We didn't see any rules, did we, Charlie? Wrong, sir. Wrong. Under Section 37B of the contract signed by him, it states quite clearly that all offers shall become null and void if, and you can read for yourself in his photostatic copy, I, the undersigned, shall forfeit all rights, privileges, and licenses herein and herein contained, etc., etc. Fax mentis incendium gloria cultum, etc., etc. Nemo bis punitor della capum. It's all there, black and white, clear as crystal. You stole fizzy lifting drinks. You bumped into the ceiling, which now has to be washed and sterilized, so you get nothing. You lose. Good day, sir. You're a thief and a swindler. That's what you are. How can you do a thing like this? Filling up our little boy's hopes and then smash all his dreams to pieces. You're an inhuman monster. I said good day. Charlie, let's get out of here. Yeah, it's the last thing I ever do. Whoever wants a gobstopper, he'll get one.
Walker?
Charlie's a good deed.
Charlie. You what? You did it! You did it! I knew you would! I just knew you would!
Oh, Charlie, forgive me for putting you through this. Please, forgive me.
Come in, Mr. Wilkinson. Charlie!
All right, so you get the idea, hopefully. I think this one little clip illustrates what I'm really, hopefully, what you're hearing me say with regards to the Old Testament. One picture is this picture of, Old Testament law and this idea of legalism and the do's and the don'ts and kind of that fierce, angry God. But then you've got this picture of a childlike faith demonstrated with obedience, whole heart obedience, not sinless perfection. Charlie wasn't sinlessly perfect, but he demonstrates this heart that at the end he shows and demonstrates his loyalty, and then he wins, and you all know what happens next. He goes out of the top of the factory in the great glass elevator and all of that. So he wins the role, and that's a picture of Old Testament loyalty that I want us to remember. It's this picture here. That's the expectation of Israel. So we get to the end of the book of Deuteronomy, and chapter 31, interestingly, we see some evidence of the writing down activity of the Torah, the instructions, in chapter 31, verse 9. Moses wrote this Torah and gave it to the priests and the sons of Levi, who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and all of the elders of Israel, in verse 24 through 29. And it came about when Moses finished writing the words of this Torah in a book until they were complete, that Moses commanded the Levites who carried the Ark of the Covenant, saying, "Take this book of the Torah, place it beside the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God, that it will remain there as a witness against you, now and into the future, of where you're going, for I know your rebellion and your stubbornness. Behold, while I'm still alive with you today, you have been rebellious against the Lord. How much more after my death?" So there's a little bit of potential concern there. But what we have here, you think of the Torah as kind of the Constitution. It's an interesting thing because the next chapter we have a song, the Song of Moses, and much like what we have in the history of our nation, we have a constitution that defines us, and then we have a national anthem that we sing as a way of remembering. So that might be a creative way of bringing those two things together. And Moses is going to pass the baton of leadership to Joshua chapter 31, we saw that in verses 7 and 8. Moses calls Joshua and says to him in the sight of all Israel, he says, "Be strong and courageous, for you shall go with this people into the land which the Lord your God has sworn to their fathers to give them, and you shall give it to them as an inheritance. And the Lord is the one who goes ahead of you. He will be with you. He will not fail you or forsake you. Do not fear or be dismayed." Remember that line, be strong and courageous. Because when the baton's passed, we're going to see, we'll flip the pages over, that same phrase come up multiple times in Joshua's halftime speech that he gives to the nation Israel in the Promised Land. Chapter 34, if we turn to the very end, after the song and the blessing that Moses gives, in chapter 33, we have chapter 34. And I probably would attribute this to a scribe of Joshua, written as a fitting tribute to the author of the Pentateuch. I don't think we have to say that Moses is writing about his own death here. This was probably as a tribute postscript, but honoring the author of the Pentateuch. Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho, and the Lord showed him all the land, Gilead as far as Dan and Naphtali. And the Lord says to him, verse 4, "This is the land which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not go over there." So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he was buried in the valley of the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, but no man knows his burial place to this day. So Moses isn't writing that. It's a scribe of Joshua after they enter into the land of Canaan. And so the book of Deuteronomy then serves as a bookend to the entire Pentateuch, Genesis being the front, Deuteronomy being the last. So that's what we have in the book of Deuteronomy. Let's summarize the context. There's the plains of Moab, and baton's now passed to Joshua. What are some of the big ideas that we walk away from now having completed the Pentateuch? Pretty huge. I mean, there's a lot of theology. We started at the very beginning when we started talking about the Pentateuch. Even in the early chapters of Genesis, remember? I asked you a midterm exam question on that. Yahweh is king and creator, the bearing of the name and the image of the king, Genesis 1 through 11. Yahweh is king, is offering life in response to the loyalty of his and blessing through this relationship that's established, this covenant relationship. And we saw the problem is introduced all the way at the beginning, chapter 3, the fall, the fallenness of humanity, why is the world the way it is? All of these are things that we walk away from understanding, having read the very first 11 chapters of Genesis. Chapters 12 through 50, we start to see examples of what the life of faith looks like, warts and all, in the life of the patriarchs. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, and more so, we saw the other sons of Jacob in the Joseph narrative. Sibling rivalry, jealousy, the ongoing struggle of maintaining covenant relationship. How do I trust in the Lord when I don't even have a son yet? Remember Abraham and the struggle over the son with his wife Sarah? So all of these are lessons, I think, intended for Israel. Israel reads the patriarchal history and understands, oh, I see myself in the life of Abraham. I see myself in the life of Joseph in Egypt or at the bottom of a well, those kinds of things. And then we get into the life of the history of Israel as she, as a nation, takes off. The book of Exodus. And we see some of the big ideas there. Yahweh is going to be the high point there is the invitation into covenant relationship. Now not just as an individual or household, a whole nation. So we saw that at Mount Sinai. The marriage relationship, the marriage ceremony at Mount Sinai was central to the book of Exodus. And how to, maintain that status as Segulah. How are we going to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation? Where are we going to worship? How are we going to deal with sin? and all those lessons that start coming out of the book of Exodus and the book of Leviticus. The establishment of the priesthood was central to Israel. We need people to help guide us in dealing with sin on an ongoing, faithful basis. So that's the book of Leviticus, and Numbers is going to begin that travel log of going from point A to point B and the struggle at Kadesh Barnea. Remember that fork in the road there? First opportunity to take the land, but we fail. We had our golden calf episode earlier, but now we're failing, not able to trust in the Lord and trust Him to go into the land. So this generation needs to be moved through a wilderness experience. 40 years later, now we have another generation that comes on the scene, and the ongoing instruction that Moses gives this generation in the book of Deuteronomy. So final instructions, that's what we've just finished. How are we going to express kingdom of priests, holy nation in the land? We've got opposition, Moses. What are we going to do? Fight some battles? We don't even have an army that's really equipped or prepared. The Lord's going to win the day. He's going to win the battles for you. The Lord's going in front of you, not behind you. So don't forget, be strong and courageous, Israel, is what Moses leaves. And he passes that baton, the full thing, the corpus, the Pentateuch, 5 books of the Old Testament, written down in book form, put in a filing cabinet on wheels to be rolled into the promised land. You probably bought it at Home Depot, on sale. Sorry, that was supposed to be funny. Okay, all right, moving on. So Joshua, the baton is passed. There's our slide. And Joshua's going to begin his ministry, leading the people. And really the theme of the book of Joshua is all about the land. The land is going to be central. Now we have a little scholarly discussion. We'll spend a little time talking about the book of Joshua. You see it there in the organizational scheme of the Hebrew canon. We've looked at this before. Remember, it ends with Chronicles. We've made that point before. But it's organized under you might say, the many books, Law, Prophets, and Writings. So Joshua, in the Hebrew arrangement or organization, is going to begin, interestingly, that section called Prophets, Nevi'im. The former prophets, Joshua through Kings, and then the latter prophets. The major prophets, we call them major and minor prophets. So that whole middle section begins with the book of Joshua. So the Pentateuch is on its own, Joshua through the prophets, and then we have the writings. Now, the scholarly conversation kind of gets into this idea of where does the book of Deuteronomy fit with the prophets or the Pentateuch and the section called prophets. We'll talk briefly just a little bit about this. Critical scholars want to move the book of Deuteronomy and attach it with the middle section, or the kind of like what they'll call, they'll attach it to the group called the former prophets and want to separate it from the Pentateuch. So they'll call for a Tetrateuch, Genesis through Numbers. And the reason that some critical scholars want to do this is that they're seeing the book of Deuteronomy, and not the book of Deuteronomy not as a result of the author Moses. Remember, we talked about JEDP, or the documentary hypothesis, that's going to assign the book of Deuteronomy as the product of the 7th century BC, probably do what's called a Deuteronomic school, right in and around the time of King Josiah and those reform efforts. Remember, that's the critical theory. I'm not going there, but I'm just trying to help you understand. Deuteronomy comes in and around that time of the 7th century. So this, I don't know if we need to go any more. Another critical idea that kind of fuels this idea is that critical scholars want to call for or identify Israel's rigid monotheism. It didn't come first. It came after the efforts of the prophets and efforts like we see with the product of the book of Deuteronomy. So it came after the prophets operating at this time, not before. So it takes the authorship completely off of Moses, originally hearing from the Lord and introducing Israel to monotheism, worshiping the one true God. The Shema, hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. That didn't come from Moses. That came from some author or group of authors in the 7th century. That's the critical idea, just so that you know in case you run into it at some time. So this whole Deuteronomic history, Martin Noth is one of the critical scholars who argues for this. Deuteronomic history, the book of Deuteronomy is going to basically inaugurate this whole period of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, and be thought of as kind of a corpus. All right. The primary reason, or the primary focus of the book of Joshua will be on the land. So there's our little Lego reenactment there. And you see this in the organization of the book. So the book of Deuteronomy, the book of Joshua is organized into major sections. We're going to see the first section, chapters 1 through 5-ish, entrance into Canaan. Then we're going to have the conquest, the largest portion there, chapter 5 through 12. And then we're going to have the land divided up. The land of Canaan will be divided up amongst the 12 tribes. And then we're going to have a final section with regards to covenant renewal or focus on obedience in the land. So this is the natural organization. So finally, if we go all the way back to the original patriarchal promise to Abraham, we go back to Genesis 12, 1 through 3. Remember that the Lord promised the patriarch Abraham an unconditional promise. I'm going to through you will emerge a great nation, and you, once that nation is formed, will have a place to express itself in a particular land. So now we have the fulfillment of this coming through in the book of Joshua. Finally, we're getting to the land of Canaan. So that's what we have here. Now that's going to be eventually something I'll show you here in another video clip. But let's take a look at Joshua chapter 1, verses 1 through 9. I need a preacher. I need someone to read this with Weston. You're my preacher for the day. I want you to read. This is a halftime locker room speech coming from Joshua to his team. You ready? Go ahead. Chapter 1, starting in verse 1.
Death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, that the Lord spoke to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' servant, saying, Moses, my servant is dead. Now therefore arise across this Jordan, you and all this people, to the land which I am giving to them, the sons of Israel. Every place on which the sole of your foot treads, I have given it to you, just as I spoke to Moses. From the wilderness and this Lebanon, even as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, and the land of the Hittites, and as far as the great sea, toward the setting of the sun, will be your territory. No man will be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I have been with Moses, I will be with you. I will not fail you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall give this people possession of the land which I swore to their fathers to give them. Only be strong and very courageous. Be careful to do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, so that you may have success wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have success. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not tremble or be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go.
Pretty good. Could have given a little more pizzazz. If you were a coach of a team, talking to your team that's down, behind, has fallen behind in the point to,
You want to be behind.
Oh, yeah. Okay, I have to let my Hoosier nerdiness come through. One of the greatest movies of all time, the movie Hoosiers. Gene Hackman has a little team, his little team from southern Indiana. They're on the skids, but they're behind. He's going to give them a halftime speech. All right, here we go. Hickory, Milan is the real life team. They're behind.
There's a condition term in play. I'm not talking about the next step until you climb the one in front of you. I'm sure going to the state finals is beyond your wildest dreams, so let's just keep it right there. Forget about the crowds, the size of the school, their fancy uniforms, and remember what got you here. Focus on the fundamentals we've gone over time and time again. And most important, don't get caught up thinking about winning or losing this game. If you put your effort and concentration into playing to your potential, to be the best that you can be, I don't care what the scoreboard says at the end of the game, in my book, we're going to be winners.
Okay. There's the famous clap right there. That's where it comes from. Everybody starts clapping.
All right. Let's go.
All right. So there's I love that speech because it reiterates exactly where Israel is at this stage, right? It's the little Hickory, the small little basketball team from southern Indiana, taking on the big giant from Terre Haute in the north, coming down for the finals of the Indiana State Championship basketball. And he's saying, what have we done to get here? We go back to the basics. We don't deviate from the plan. God's let us know what we need to know, and the victory will be ours because we'll do it God's way. It's interesting that when they get later, I've got another clip here, and we'll end today with this clip. There's a point in the game when the coach has to be reminded of no trick plays. We're going to go with what's got us here, and that's faithfulness and obedience to the Lord, and that's going to win the day. So let's just, we got to show this. Definitely got to show this. Woo, that's kind of loud, isn't it? No.
What's the matter with you? I'll make it. Honey, get the moment Jimmy off the team. Let's go. Please.
And if you're a true Hoosier, like I am, that's where you always start to cry every time you rewatch that movie over and over and over again. So it's fitting that the be strong and courageous encouragement that Joshua is giving Israel is not unlike what we see in this movie. It's just stay true to the basics, don't deviate from the plan, and trust in the Lord who's gotten you this far. Jimmy Chitwood was the basketball sure shot, and he's the one that would take the last shot, and he knew he'd make the shot because he's made a lot of shots like that before. So, all right, well, I couldn't think of a better way to end today's lecture. So I knew you probably think I planned it that way. I did. So I'll see you next week.
Yeah.